Welcome to this afternoon's lecture. I'm just going to call everyone's attention here for a moment while I go through a few housekeeping things before we get started. Number one is there are several nice seats right up here at the front, and I've promised not to embarrass him, but there are VIP seats with the dean up here at the front, so anyone that is interested in getting a little closer, you're welcome to do so. Before we begin, I'd like to draw your attention to our event sponsors as they are listed on the slide behind me here. We are grateful for their contribution to the continuity of the Bentley Lecture in Sustainable Agriculture. And our lecture will begin in just a few minutes. So as a few people are still doing so, grab your coffee and then find your seat. That's a great choice at this time. The bar will close now, it already has, for the duration of the talk and will reopen following the lecture. If you choose to enjoy that service this afternoon, just please consider your options for a safe ride home. We want to make sure everyone gets home safely today. And if you need to excuse yourself at all during the lecture to use the washroom or otherwise, please use the doors at the back there. You'll draw less attention to yourself than up at the front. I'm sure everyone prefers that. We also ask that you just take a moment to silence your cell phones before we begin. Our lecture will be just about an hour in length, followed by a Q&A. And it seems that we've pretty well settled here while I've been speaking, so I'm going to turn the podium over to Dr. Blade, Dean of the Faculty of Agricultural, Life and Environmental Sciences.
Thank you very much, Kathleen, and thank you to the organizing team and to all of you for coming this afternoon. Not in my prepared notes, but if you were over on the other side for the posters, I think a round of applause for our students, right? They did just such a great job. If you haven't been there, please feel free to visit after the lecture and question period, because just such a great amount of work on display. As you know, the University of Alberta has a land acknowledgement that we usually read. It talks about the fact that we are here on Treaty 6 territory and that we respect the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples. But I want to tell you about the things that we think about in our faculty. Our faculty works in Treaty 6, 7, and 8 and beyond. So we think very much about the communities and the land that we work on. Some of you may know that we have a ranch out at Kinsella. And whenever I go out there, I really always try to take some time because there are the Viking ribstones. I don't know, has anybody ever seen the Viking ribstones? You know, when you see that spiritual area that has been a location of pilgrimage over several centuries, again, it just refers and reminds me and perhaps us of the traditional peoples that have been on that land for a long period of time. And I would also just point out, a couple of weeks ago, we had the University of Alberta Round Dance. And to see people from across our community and to see the whole array of communities coming from various First Nations groups from around the Edmonton region, it was just so great to see. So for sure, I want to do the standard land acknowledgement, but I think we just all need to reflect a little bit about all the ways that working with Indigenous communities really touches our lives, both past, present, and future. And to that, I will just say that it's been nearly 2 years since the introduction of Braiding Past, Present, and Future, the University of Alberta's Indigenous Strategic Plan. That was led by an Indigenous Advisory Council and unanimously approved by the General Faculties Council and the Board of Governors. The plan continues to work towards fulfilling the university's commitments to the TRC calls to action and broader Indigenous initiatives. The accountabilities in the plan touch every facet of institutional mandate, including the strengthening and improving recruitment, retention, and completion rates of students, enhancing community collaboration with Indigenous nations, and integrating Indigenous content into teaching and learning experiences to address identified knowledge gaps. The Sweetgrass teachings offered in the plan are a gentle reminder of the power we possess. Our actions today can leave an impactful legacy for the next 7 generations and beyond. We invite you to read the plan and reflect on how you can deepen your understanding and appreciation of Indigenous peoples, past and present. And we invite you to engage with the University Strat Plan online, or you're welcome to take a hard copy, which are out front. And I will just acknowledge Trina is also here as well from the back that brought those over. So thank you very much, Trina. That's very kind. Right. I feel like I'm taking up a lot of your space. We're going to get to Dr. Arcand in a minute. I appreciate your patience. I'm just going to give you a little quick summary of the Bentley Lecture. Professor Fred Bentley's academic career spanned over 36 years, with the majority of that being here at the University of Alberta. And that included a term that he served as dean from 1958 to 1968 of our faculty. Dr. Bentley's research as a soil scientist made great contributions to the development of sustainable agricultural practices in Alberta. Dr. Bentley received the Distinguished Alumni Award, the university's highest award that we can bestow upon an alumnus. And the Bentley Lecture in Sustainable Agriculture is based on an endowment fund that was created in Dr. Bentley's name, so that each year we can invite a speaker of international renown to present current research and updates in areas related to soil science, agricultural production methods, and sustainable agriculture. And we certainly, as Kathleen has done, would like to make an acknowledgement of the supporters of this year's lecture, the Alberta Institute of Agrologists, Alberta Grains, and Corteva Agriscience. Now the exciting part. Today's distinguished researcher honors the long tradition of the Bentley Lecture Series. Dr. Melissa Arcand is an associate professor in the Department of Soil Science at the University of Saskatchewan and is a member of the Muskeg Lake Cree Nation in Treaty 6. Dr. Arcand researches soil health, carbon storage, and nutrient cycling in agroecosystems. Her recent interdisciplinary research focused on Indigenous agriculture in the prairies, including a SSHRC Connections Grant-funded Forum on Indigenous Agriculture in Saskatchewan. Dr. Arcand also collaborated with First Nations lands departments to assess soils on agricultural lands with support from the New Frontiers in Research Fund, an explorations grant, and alongside Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, agricultural climate solutions in their living labs. Dr. Arcand's team is developing and delivering outreach activities in soil health and agricultural beneficial management practices to First Nations through a Weston Family Foundation Soil Health Initiative project. In addition to her research, and if you have a look at her Dr. Arcand's CV, it is quite impressive, and service work, Dr. Arcand teaches and is the academic advisor for students in the Kanawayihetaytan Askiy Group Indigenous Land and Resource Management Certificate Program. That particular group, and the name in Plains Cree, refers to "Let us take care of the land." You are sick of hearing me talk. Please, let's invite and help me to welcome Dr. Arcand to the podium.
Thanks for that introduction. I'm just going to load up my talk here. All right, should be good to go. All right, Danse Kakio, Melissa Arcand Nitsigasun, Muskeg Lake Ochinia. So I just wanted to greet everyone. Hello, my name is Melissa Arcand. I'm from Muskeg Lake Cree Nation. Thank you for the introduction. Thanks for the opportunity to share my perspectives and the work that I've been doing the last number of years. Really appreciate this kind of forum, and especially the fact that graduate students had the opportunity to present their research with the poster presentation. It's really nice to have this opportunity to kind of share the work that everybody's doing. And so I really value your time, and thanks to the organizers for bringing me out to Edmonton and to University of Alberta for this. So really appreciate that. So probably over the last 8 years or so, I've had the honor to teach First Nations land managers from all across Canada. And in the course that I teach, it's a natural science course. It's the only natural science course in the program. It's a field studies in the environment class. And I have the students, before they come to Saskatoon, select 3 sites within their home community and ask them to sort of observe and make notes about what they see within those landscapes, and for them to collect a soil sample and then bring it back to Saskatoon when they come. And we, do basic soil characterization, and we talk about, okay, well, how do these soil properties relate to the context from which you collected these soils? And we have, this great conversation. And inevitably, every single student from Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta will bring at least one, if not two or three soils that they collected from an agricultural field, whether it's a annually cropped field or whether it's pasture land, but within their home communities. And so through those stories that I hear students tell about their home communities and what they're facing in terms of agriculture that's happening on their lands, it really kind of hits home with me and my background, and then also it really helps to spark some of the questions that have been emerging in some of the research work that I've been doing over the last number of years. So today what I'm going to do is sort of reflect on some of those experiences and ongoing research to outline some of the threats and the major risks to soil health within, specifically I'm going to focus on First Nations in the prairies and more specifically in Saskatchewan, which is where I live and work. And then also provide a couple of examples of some current projects that I'm doing that are really aiming to contribute to working with communities to help better safeguard their soils and their agricultural ecosystems. And then kind of bring some more broader perspectives overall on sort of initiatives and strategies and even worldviews in terms of agricultural land management and the way that we produce food across the prairies. So in order to sort of talk about my perspective or share some perspectives, I want to start by where that started. So this is Muskeg Lake Cree Nation. So my home community, it's about an hour north of Saskatoon, also in Treaty 6 territory. And this picture is of Muskeg Lake, and if we look to the left-hand side of the photo, it's a place that the community calls the Island. And this is where cultural ceremonies take place. This is where we have cultural camps for youth and families to come and learn and practice culture and language. And this is also where the land-based education center is that's associated with the school within the community. And I want to highlight this because this is really where probably the seeds were set for me as a young person in, number one, being interested in the environment and the land, but number two, really having the opportunity to learn from elders and knowledge keepers within my own community, but also from communities in neighboring First Nations and neighboring communities, because there's a long legacy of our cultural traditions being undermined and being disrupted, through processes of colonization, including residential schools, that some of those cultural teachings weren't necessarily all strong within our community. So we, again, needing to reach out, needing to learn from others, and needing to sort of rely on other communities to be able to revive some of those cultural traditions. And so if we take a bird's eye view of where I took that photo, you can see the lake on the west side of this image. And I took the photo kind of looking north, standing on that road, and you can see the trees to the west. And then, but if you go to the east, very quickly the landscape changes, right? So we moved, away from lakes and forests and towards agricultural land. And about a mile, sort of east and a little bit north, you can see a farmyard, and that's where I grew up. So this is what the land looked like just a mile away from the lake. And so my dad, he farmed for about 37 years as a conventional grain farmer. And the picture on the right is my mom's garden, which I spent hours and hours with my grandma, with my cookum, and my mom, and my family, weeding and harvesting potatoes, et cetera, et cetera. And so really these soils provided the livelihood for my family growing up. But of course, when you're young, you take all of that for granted. And I didn't give any consideration about the soils as a young person. And it wasn't actually until I went to the University of Guelph as an undergrad student that I kind of got the bug for soil science. So I was lucky to get an undergrad research position in a soil science lab and ended up driving all over southwestern Ontario with a team of undergrads and grad students collecting soil samples. And the first time I took my soil probe and, put it into the soil to collect a sample, pull out the sample, and I look at this sort of dark or light brown, gray colored soil, I thought, what the heck is this soil? Like, it looks so sad and so sick. And what I, really kind of came to learn through my training in soil science is, it wasn't necessarily that the soil was sick. Maybe some of it was not in great health. But really what I came to understand is place matters, context matters, and, the soils that we had been collecting in southwestern Ontario developed under a Carolinian forest and were luvisols. And, the soils that I grew up around were black chernozems, which would have developed under a completely different environment, native grasses, rich organic matter, and historically would have had, across the North America, 30 million bison roaming through, at one point or another, right? So the history of our landscapes really, really dictates, what we see even today, right? Thousands of years of soil development. But I think what I want to make the point is that the soils that developed here were not in the absence of people prior to, settlement of the plains. Indigenous people, Indigenous people also occupied these lands and relied on these lands for their livelihood. The buffalo being, the keystone species, one of the major food sources, but there were also, vegetables that were harvested, and that there was a real intentional interaction. I mean, it's not the same kind of agriculture that we see today. Our 1 mile by 1 mile squares that you can easily see from an airplane. But nevertheless, Plains Indigenous people interacted with the land in an intentional way, and able to support their food systems and their livelihoods and their health of their communities. So when I think about Indigenous agroecosystems, this is, historically, this is kind of, part of that, right? And so people would have been integrated within this as well. So, we can't just think of the past without the people having been there as well. And of course, picture of a chernozem for everybody. That nice, rich black soil, which is what I grew up with, right? My mud pies were made of black soil, so much different than what I would have learned about soils in an Ontarian context. So in the prairies, of course, we understand the agriculture is the dominant industry, and, we basically comprise 80% of Canada's agricultural land base. But at least in Saskatchewan, the numbers, of course, would be different in Alberta. Only about 14% of intact grasslands, are actually remain. Much of the grasslands have been converted to annual crop production or even pasture land. And so, agriculture really has obviously made its mark. And that's also the case for First Nations communities within the agricultural region of the prairies. So agriculture is a dominant land use within First Nations reserve lands across the prairies and south of the boreal forest. So there's, a few thousand acres of cropland. So those numbers are just cropland based on Ag Canada's annual crop inventory data. It doesn't include pasture lands. And so I wanted to show a picture of, what kind of present day, an example of present day agroecosystem within a First Nations community. So, we've got a lot going on. We've got, of course, our field, but we also have a lake. We've got some wetlands in the bottom left. But what's also really important to see here is that we have houses. We have people's homes that are, integrated within these landscapes that in some cases are really close to these agricultural fields. But unfortunately, at least in the last, 50 years or so, the food that gets produced in these landscapes isn't being eaten by community members, and the money that's being generated from the farming activities are also not going to those community members as well. So this is very quite common. So we're going to kind of zoom out even further and look at taking just a Google Earth image of the prairies. And what I want to kind of point out is that reserve lands, they can jump out at you, even just by looking at satellite imagery. And so last week I was with the community and I showed this image and I said, if you look at Saskatchewan, starting from the kind of down here, the southeast, and we work our way along the prairie parkland region, there's little pockets of green. And when I ask people, what do you think those pockets of green are? Parks, conservation areas. But in large part, these are the borders of First Nations reserves. And you can, in some cases, not all cases, but in some cases, you can see a really stark line of where those borders are. In the sort of Saskatchewan region, a lot of that green is because it's bush, it's trees. But if we were even to look at Alberta in the southern region, there's a high incidence of grasslands that are present within these reserve boundaries. And so what I'm trying to, I guess the point is here is that reserve lands really come out distinct in terms of what's there, what's present. And there's a lot of questions, and a lot of ideas as to why. There's probably a huge suite of complex factors as to why they are quite distinct, and a lot of history and a lot of culture that would also go into explaining why there might be this distinctiveness within First Nations communities. And so taking a look still at this image, I want to point out different borders. So the green, those are their treaty territories. So across treaties 4, 6, 7, actually even to Treaty 8, agricultural provisions and lands that were meant to be set aside for agriculture featured heavily in the historical numbered treaties that span the prairie provinces. And so these are excerpts from each of the sort of main treaties that span a lot of the agricultural region, indicating specific provisions for agriculture. And so what is often not taught or not talked about so much is that when the treaties were negotiated, these were extensive conversations, and what came out in the written text doesn't necessarily reflect the depth and breadth of the conversations that were held between the chiefs, their advisors, the Crown representatives, and that what's also really important to understand is that when the Indigenous leaders entered into treaty, it was done in ceremony, and it was a sacred act. And so when we hear from our elders, and we even hear from written accounts from non-Indigenous people who were there during treaty negotiations, nothing was said about actually surrendering and ceding the land, because from an Indigenous worldview, the land wasn't owned, and so therefore couldn't just be given away and ceded. And so I just wanted to highlight a couple of these quotes from elders who had shared from their perspective what they had learned through the oral history. So the first elder says, "We made a covenant with Her Majesty's government, and a covenant is not just a relationship between people, it's a relationship between three parties, you, the Crown, and me, First Nations, and the Creator." And then this other quote, "The sacred earth could never be sold or given away according to the principles of the First Nations, but it could be shared. The First Nations decided that the earth could be shared with the newcomers and that it could be shared to the depth of a plow blade. The earth could be shared so that everyone could peacefully exist." And so that was the conception, or at least part of the conception, that Indigenous people entered into those treaties with. So, not surprising. We kind of understand the history that came after 1876, which is when Treaty 6 was signed. But a lot of those treaty promises were broken, and specifically with agriculture, not to talk about the other parts of the treaty, but just within what happened after the treaty was signed, there's a major impediments and barriers for First Nations people to really engage in agriculture in a way that could be competitive with non-Indigenous people. And that's because there was real policy that prevented and that basically stopped what would have been likely a probably pretty flourishing agricultural sector and agricultural activities within First Nations communities. And there's actually historical documentation that shows that prior to some of these government policies being imposed, that First Nations were doing quite well with agriculture. There's literal yield records, how many bushels of potatoes, how many calves were right, whatever it might be, right? There's good records of those because Indigenous people were documented very closely, and so there are records that show that. But in addition to farmers being marginalized, and so we have a very few First Nations farmers within the prairies, our lands were also marginalized. So I'm going to just highlight two ways that lands were marginalized. So number one, when the treaties were signed, the size of the reserve land bases were intended to reflect the population at the time that those treaties were signed. But in a lot of instances, it was underestimated. Well, the land size was surveyed at a much smaller amount than it should have been. And so there has been more modern day, in the 1990s, in Saskatchewan especially, court cases that essentially are trying to rectify that shortfall of acres that should have been originally surveyed. So that's one way. It's just we didn't get the amount of land that we should have. The second way that reserves lands were marginalized is that after reserve lands were surveyed in the late 1800s, early 1900s, a good amount of them were then subsequently surrendered for sale to the Crown for various reasons. So railroad expansion, wanting land for new European settlers who were coming in, and then a major other reason was for soldier settlement. So after the First and Second World War, the Canadian government needed to allocate lands for those returning veterans so they could start their farm operations. And well, where could they easily get some land? From the First Nations people. And so in Saskatchewan and Alberta and Manitoba, over 500,000 acres of land were surrendered for sale from this. And so because we're soil scientists, I have to show a soil map. So this is agricultural land capability classes. So green being class 1, moving into yellow, orange, red, sort of the more marginal lands. And what I'm showing here is on the top, the black boundaries were the boundaries of the First Nations when the soils were surveyed in the 1960s. And so we have a community towards the north and then the community towards the south. But what I want to point out is that the red sort of hatched boundaries depict the original reserve land bases before the surrender happened. And you can see really clearly, if you look within the red, the green, right? So between both communities, losses of the most highly productive agricultural land are class 1, class 2 lands. So between those two communities, that's about 27,000 acres. And this happened across, not just within these two communities, but across all of the prairies. And so, we were lucky we had, because the Saskatchewan Institute of Pedology in the 1960s surveyed all the soils of First Nations in Saskatchewan that were south of the boreal forest, we could actually compile what this looked like. And so if we look on the very far left, we can see the number of acres that were represented, distributed among these different agricultural classes, capability classes, across all First Nations in Saskatchewan. And so again, green, dark green being class 1, and then as you move to the right, the higher capability classes. And what I want to point out is that the gray bar actually indicates reserve lands that weren't in the original survey. So they would have been essentially in the boreal forest, because there was, at the time anyways, no thought about that being for agriculture. But nevertheless, you can see, okay, well, where were those lands sort of distributed? Then we can see, okay, well, how much land was actually lost through surrenders? And in total, about 430,000 acres in Saskatchewan. Okay, well, what did we get? What was left over? We lost a high proportion of the higher Class 1, Class 2, Class 3 lands. And then what's been really interesting is that in modern times, so post-1990s, because of treaty land entitlement, because of First Nations being able to actually pursue legal cases against the Crown and specific land claims, they now have been in the financial situation to be able to purchase new land. And so we've been able to see, okay, well, what kind of land are First Nations purchasing? And again, we kind of have a diversity. So the second to the left shows the diversity of lands that have been purchased since about the 1990s. And what's interesting is that there's actually a lot of non-agricultural land that's being purchased. So we're kind of seeing a diversification in terms of the type of land that First Nations are purchasing. So that might be land, urban land to develop economic development, business development within cities. It can be to develop forestry or oil and gas, but also it can be for completely non-economic reasons at all. It could be for acquiring lands that were in traditional territories that weren't part of their original reserve land base. So to be able to more readily access lands for cultural reasons, for hunting, for fishing, for medicine picking, and that sort of thing. And so one thing also to note is, so this is some imagery of First Nations community, again, sort of looking at the soil distribution of the agricultural capability classes. And you can see the sort of the dark block in the center there, that's the home reserve. The sort of transparent or more transparent block of land to the south, that's the land that was lost. And all the little pockets, the little small pieces of land to the north is land that they recently purchased since the 1990s. And you can see that there's only a few pieces of land that they were actually able to purchase back from what the original reserve boundary was. So what this is saying is we're not necessarily able to buy this land that we originally lost. The land is often, because of the changes in agricultural land prices, especially in the last 10 years or so, it's basically not even viable or possible to purchase land that we would have originally lost. So I just really like to highlight that because I think it's not really well known that, the land itself and the way that these reserve boundaries have changed has influenced the way that agriculture is not necessarily practiced, but the type of land that is available for agriculture. So I wanted to highlight that sort of like at that macro scale of how that can have effects on the way that agriculture is being practiced within First Nations. Now, I guess just backing up again, so we've got these different parcels of land that might be dispersed quite, spatially, and that can have a lot of challenges for land managers, for First Nations land managers. So if you have land that is 100 kilometers away, it's a lot harder to monitor what's happening on that land. And land management within First Nations can be, rather administratively complex, especially because for most First Nations in the prairies, land is administered through, according to the Indian Act, through Indigenous Services Canada. And for a lot of communities whose lands are administered under the Indian Act, any funding related to land management or monies received from any agricultural leasing or other use leasing, there's actually funding formulas that will account for the number of acres that are being leased or permitted, the complexity of what those leases are, And what I've heard, at least anecdotally, from land managers is that this can incentivize conversion of marginal land that might have been on perennial cover to annual cropland, because now you might have had land that hadn't been permitted, hadn't been used. Now it's being used, and because it's being used, the funding formula will reward that use. And so there's a financial incentive to essentially break marginal land for crop production, and you might, get some productivity for the first few years or so, but then that land is much more prone to erosion, much more prone to soil degradation, and then loss of productivity over the long term. So this is, sort of a policy level issue that I'm guessing there wasn't probably much thought about what the potential implications might be, because nobody was really thinking about the soils and what their capability was for supporting agriculture. There are a number of First Nations who've entered into what's called the First Nations Land Management Framework Agreement, which enables those communities to essentially draft their own land codes or their own land legislation, their land laws. And so they're able to administer their lands outside of the Indian Act. There's some issues about this too, but what it does, it means that they can make decisions more quickly, and they don't have to rely on the federal government to give their money back once they've leased land. It's a very complicated sort of process. So it allows them to get rid of those bureaucratic hoops. And that's had some good impacts in terms of land management. So, I've talked about, okay, we don't have a lot of First Nations farmers anymore, but we do have a lot of agricultural land now that we're expanding our lands through treaty land entitlement, through these specific claims. But so what that results in is that we've got more agricultural land, fewer farmers, but agricultural production is still occurring, and it's dominated by non-Indigenous farmers. So a lot of land is leased out to local, maybe not always local, farmers as a source of revenue. But one of the issues is that oftentimes, these leases can be short in duration, so 1 to 3 years is fairly common. And while that might not be so risky if the producer, has some security in terms of being able to renew that lease, but that's not always the case. So when we have these insecure lease renewals, that of course, again, disincentivizes the farmer to really worry, to really think about the long-term sustainability of that land. And again, because we have fewer First Nations farmers, we have fewer people that have, experience in this realm, what this means is that there's also land managers who might not necessarily have that sort of more intimate knowledge of agricultural practices, of things to look out for in terms of sustainable use of the land. And really, the management decisions have basically devolved to the farmer. And all of this said, talking with within my own community and others, there are concerns about, well, why don't we have those medicines anymore? Why can't I find those berries that we used to pick? And just overall kind of concerns about, well, what is the impact of agriculture on the land within our community? So that's a lot of background, but I think it's necessary because I don't know that the general population really gets informed about these things within, just within our backyards, right? So all of that to kind of lead up and provide the context for some of the projects that I'm involved with now. So I want to talk really briefly about a really recent project, which is the Bridge to Land, Water, Sky Living Lab. And so this was funded through Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's Agriculture Climate Solutions Living Lab program. The lead is Mistawasis in close partnership with Muskeg Lake Cree Nation, my home community. And for those who don't know about the Living Lab program, it's really meant to be sort of a collaborative effort that brings together farmers, researchers, other stakeholders within the agricultural sector to work to basically co-develop, different agricultural practices, best management practices, and then trial those out in sort of a real farm scenario. So we're not talking about small plot research that we might see at universities or government research stations, but really trying to work within sort of these complex landscapes and real working farms. And of course, because this is agricultural climate solutions, the major focus is reducing greenhouse gas emissions and increasing carbon sequestration. But we took this as an opportunity to, yes, we want that outcome of improved climate change mitigation, but there's a lot of other things that we can say are co-benefits that we're looking at within the context of this project. And so I also just want to acknowledge Anthony Johnston. At the time of the proposal writing, he was a special projects manager for Mr. He's since retired, deservingly, but he is the person who pulled together the group of researchers, who pulled together the various environmental nonprofit organizations to really form this collaborative team. He's also the person who coined the name Bridge to Land, Water, Sky. So again, I just want to share a quote. So Anthony wanted to share this, and so what he says is, "A bridge connects people, communities, ideas, and landscapes. A bridge connects past, present, and future. The Bridge to Land, Water, Sky shares landscape and experience and hope for a good future." And it's also kind of important to note that Chief Mistawasis, who was the original chief of Mistawasis Nehewak, he was the first signatory of Treaty 6. And we literally have in Saskatoon a bridge called Chief Mistawasis Bridge, so it's kind of fitting that we, again, this notion of bridging across different groups and across, even time in terms of thinking about the way our ancestors lived, and we think about the future too in terms of 7 generations into the future. So what are some of the goals, just very broadly, of the Living Lab? So of course, focusing on improving agricultural practices, land management strategies. So we've got 2 broad interventions that are going to be implemented on the land, and then we'll have scientists sort of coming alongside to measure various things, including soil carbon, among other things. But the one sort of area of focus is around croplands. And so in the context of croplands, what we're looking at there is, improved input optimization, so nutrient use efficiency, especially around nitrogen management. The second piece that we're looking at our croplands is increasing crop cover or crop diversification. So that's where things like intercropping and cover cropping and the use of various organic soil amendments might come in. And then the third piece that we're looking at is landscape diversification. So within sort of an annually cropped field where we have less productive or more marginal parts of the field, maybe saline areas, what are some strategies of maybe some perennialization that we might do in those more marginal parts of the field to sort of take those out of production because they're not productive anyway, and sort of gain some of those other ecosystem services from those fields. So that's our croplands. The second piece of it, again, because a lot of within our communities, we do have some of these more marginal lands. What we're looking at is, can we either restore those lands back into perennial vegetation in one way or another, or for pasture land, can we rejuvenate those pastures? So that's kind of like the core interventions, I would say, or activities that we're doing with the local producers. But that's just one of the goals. What's also been really important, what we've heard from the communities, is increasing food security and sovereignty is a huge, huge motivation for engaging in this project. The third one is protecting biodiversity and protecting water. The fourth one is creating employment and learning opportunities for youth and other community members, but also surrounding communities as well. And then the fifth is, because we have this historical legacy of non-Indigenous farmers farming the land, what we're also wanting to build something towards is really reimagining these relationships between the non-Indigenous producers and the First Nations landholders to be not just a financial transaction, but to actually come together and talk about, well, what are our goals, for this land? Obviously, the farmer's profitability is really key here, but what are, how can we look at other things within these landscapes that can be done, that can still maintain profitability, but achieve some of these other goals for the community whose land it is. And so, as you can imagine, this has been a very multi-layered, sort of communications activity, and the engagement process is much more complicated, I would argue, than some of the other living labs where, yes, you've got your producers, you've got your, agronomy experts, you've got your researchers. That's complicated enough. I'm sure for others here in the room have done work on farm or in collaboration with producers, right? You understand, that can be really complicated. Sometimes different languages are being spoken, but we've added this extra layer of the First Nation, who's the lead, who actually, it's their land. And then again, sort of like the conversations that have happened between the First Nation, especially we work closely with the lands departments and the researchers, and then again, bringing the producers into those conversations. So one of my collaborators within the project says, what does a living lab look like? And he said, it looks like a lunch meeting. Like lots of lunch meetings have been happening over the last year and a half just to get people understanding, okay, well, what is the lay of the land? And so, yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, for a lot of the scientists who are on this project, we kind of we're like, how do it's not replicated, we're like, how are we going to publish this? But at the same time, the amount of work that we're doing to even just have these conversations so that the First Nations land manager even understands, like, well, what is sort of the arc of a growing season? This is where, at least personally, where I'm excited and feel like there'll be, impact with the work that we're doing. We'll find a way to publish it as well, but this has been, sort of the exciting part of this work. And so, as I mentioned before, having youth be involved, having community members get more engaged with what's happening on the land and understanding, even understanding, well, what is the farmer facing? Like, what are the decision-making factors that farmer is facing? And can they start to understand, the constraints? Because there's huge constraints, and, for everybody. Having those conversations have been really, really fruitful. And so this actually leads me to another project that's really related. So I was able to get some funding through the Weston Family Foundation Soil Health Initiative to develop an outreach and engagement project. So it's not a research project, but it's really closely in tandem with the Living Lab, because what we're hoping to do with the SAGE project, which we're calling it the Soil and Agroecosystem Project, is to basically expand the regional reach of the learning that we're going to generate through the Living Lab to a broader sort of community base, so across Saskatchewan, not just within sort of the more closely knit part of our Living Lab. And so we're developing outreach and education activities really focused on soil health, agricultural best management practices, but we've collaborated with the International Buffalo Relations Institute, which is a nonprofit organization that is associated with the Buffalo Treaty, which I'll talk about in a minute, and working with them with an independent consultant who has, I guess, the deep cultural knowledge of indigenous ecological knowledge within the prairies. And so what we're doing is we're developing these workshops that are going to be both on the land, and in some cases we've been doing even some webinars, that are sort of done in tandem. So even though we might be spending a whole day just talking about soil testing, what has become obvious to be so important with this type of work is that we have to kind of acknowledge who we are as Indigenous people when we do this work together. And so the way that we do that is even just simply starting this work in ceremony. And that can be something as simple as smudging together before we get this work going. And it just really helps to kind of get everybody on the same page. And so what we're doing with this work is essentially trying to establish sort of a network of soil health learning circles across the Prairie region within different communities. And we've been working with an advisory circle of First Nations land managers and experts in various realms of agriculture, traditional knowledge, buffalo caretaking, as well, to sort of re-engage our communities around these questions. And so, yeah, we're really excited. We piloted a few activities over this past summer, and then we're going to kind of expand and do more this summer, but focusing on, workshops, again, soil testing. How do you even read a soil test report? As simple as that, right? It's like things that we might take for granted. How can we even use like our mapping and drone imagery analysis to monitor agricultural lands? If we think about some of those lands that are really far afield, how can we sort of get those lands on our computers so we can start looking at them? And then another important thing is that we're working to tailor some of these workshops for young people, for youth. So last week we were visiting a community, and we did a whole workshop on seed saving with the school children. And so it's just kind of getting people's hands, smelling and touching and tasting and getting youth excited. And so one thing that is important to me, at least, is that can this work also help to improve accessibility for Indigenous students to the STEM fields? We're really underrepresented in, not just the sciences as a whole, but like especially within the natural sciences. So when you think about, land managers who are maybe dealing with 60,000 acres of agricultural land, and they're the only person on staff, it's really important that person has sort of all the tools in their toolbox to be able to, deal with that. And so, yeah, so this project is really wanting to sort of get that information out into communities that there might not be the opportunity for, say, a land manager to come to the university for 4 years to get a degree, So that's part of the motivation. So what I kind of want to end on is more broad concepts. So talked about a couple of projects that I've been working on, but underlying these projects is this deep desire for revitalization of culture, of language, of practicing traditions. And what I wanted to point out is this, it's a Cree concept, so I don't want to be pan-Indigenous in the way that I talk about First Nations necessarily. So within the Cree culture, there's this concept or principle of wakotowin, which translates as kinship, essentially, but it's much more complicated than that. And so the reason why I put this quote here is Elder Maria Campbell. She's a Métis artist, very respected in the Indigenous community, an awarded author. She wrote about what wakotowin is. And so I'm just going to read her quote again. So, there is a word in my language that speaks to these issues, wakotowin. Today, it is translated to mean kinship, relationship, and family, as in human family. But at one time, from our place, it meant the whole of creation. And our teachings taught us that all of creation is related and interconnected to all things within it. Wakotowin meant honoring and respecting those relationships. They are our stories, songs, ceremonies, and dances that taught us from birth to death our responsibilities and reciprocal obligations to each other. Human to human, human to plants, human to animals, to the water, and especially to the earth. And in turn, all of creation had responsibilities and reciprocal obligations to us. And so this concept of wakotowin is something that, at least within the Cree communities that I've both lived I don't live in, but come from and also work with, are revitalizing these concepts. And not just in terms of how we interact with the land, but how we conceptualize our education systems, how we conceptualize our healthcare systems, how we conceptualize the way that we raise our children. And so this has been something that's been very important in the work that we do, is just this revitalization. And so it really kind of drives everything. And this notion that when we think about Wahkotowan and kinship, we're not just talking about our human relatives. We're talking about the way that, you know, the plants are also our kin, our relatives. The animals are our relatives. And, you know, if we love our relatives, we're going to take care of them. And so that's really an important concept that a lot of communities are really resurging. And so this also leads to closely leads to what's also happening within the Plains, not just within Canada, but also within the United States, is the return or rematriation of buffalo, of bison, of Plains bison to the prairies. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, you know, buffalo are a keystone species. Not only were they an important food source, but they were our relative. So we're welcoming our relative back. And so there's this concept of buffalo consciousness that Leroy Little Bear, who again is a renowned Blackfoot scholar, elder, thinker, philosopher, and he is essentially the emissary of the Buffalo Treaty. So again, we started talking about treaties at the beginning between Indigenous peoples and the Crown. This is a modern day treaty that sort of reflects what would have happened pre-colonization, which was there were treaties between Indigenous nations. So this is a Indigenous nation to nation treaty, modern treaty, really meant to be responsible to our relative and bring them back. And so Leroy Little Bear talks about this concept of buffalo consciousness. And so again, I'm going to read these quotes because I think it's important to hear these quotes in these people's words. So he says, if we see the buffalo on a daily basis, that's where the consciousness arises. It becomes part of me. It's much easier for me to remember those stories and my relationship with the buffalo. If the buffalo are out there, the buffalo stories come alive. You'll be implementing the Buffalo Treaty. So the Buffalo Treaty is really talking about buffalo consciousness, but it also is material, literally, literally returning buffalo to our landscapes. And so I just wanted to end, I guess, by showing some, contemporary, present day agroecosystems on First Nations across the prairies. A lot of it probably looks really familiar to all of you because it probably looks, exactly what it looks like off reserve too. But what I'm excited about is how we're starting to think about reimagining some of these landscapes. Thinking about, well, what might these landscapes look like in 50 years? Yes, we might still be growing canola, but what else is there? And, especially thinking about those marginal lands, what else could be there? And again, when we're thinking about climate change and we're thinking of biodiversity protection, those places are havens of biodiversity right now. So can we make sure that we continue to protect those? And so what are First Nations doing? How are they safeguarding their lands? A lot of activities, especially coming out of COVID-19, was a focus on food sovereignty and food security. So communities are growing food forests, they're growing community gardens, they're growing school gardens. And again, this isn't not necessarily just because we're concerned about the land, but it's because we're concerned about making sure that children have healthy food that's accessible. A lot of communities are thinking about or already have done sort of taking over parts of grain and cattle operations within their community. So land that had been leased is now being managed by the nation. And so you think about all the lost revenue that would have been leaving the reserve when they were renting it is now retained in the reserve. And some communities are talking about, well, how do we use that extra revenue for these other activities? And again, restoring and conserving marginal lands. This has been happening as well more recently, and in large part because we do have, more funding available through these federal programs that are looking towards both biodiversity protection or carbon sequestration, and so communities are taking advantage of these programs. And then again, rematriating buffalo, and not only, or even maybe not at all, for economic development. It might be solely for community use, and solely for, again, returning that kinship relationship. And again, underlying all of these sort of material activities is just sort of returning to some of our principles, our core principles, as Cree people, Wahkohtowin, and sort of as Plains people, raising that buffalo consciousness. And again, all of this is happening because Indigenous people are asserting sovereignty over our lands and over our futures. So with that, I really want to acknowledge all the huge team of people. There's so many people who have helped me kind of share this perspective today. And then, of course, all of the organizations that support the work, either financially or through in-kind contributions, really thankful for that help because, it hasn't always existed. And then, of course, thank all of you for your attention, for letting me share all of this. It was really a great day, and I'm really thankful to have been able to participate. So thank you very much.
So there is time for a few questions, if that's okay with you. I think we'll take about 10 minutes to do some questions, if that's fine. So I will run a mic over to whoever's hand is up.
Well, someone has to.
Everyone's shy.
Formulate your questions in a hurry. I liked what you said about getting young people involved, and certainly within our faculty we think about that. I'll ask you the unanswerable question. Mm-hmm. What motivates the young people that you're working with to think about, how does this align with personal values? Is it land management? Is it thinking about, maybe what possibilities there are around productivity? Are people thinking about maybe putting that agricultural land back into Aspen Parkland? Like, what is motivating young people? And I know that asking you to say that is difficult.
Yeah, I think when I see young people really engaged and activated is when elders are present, actually. So when they get to hear from and learn from elders, the respect. So kids can be whatever, unruly and disrespectful sometimes, but when elders are present, they smarten up real quick. And so for them to be able, when they have the opportunity to be involved and to hear what the elders are saying and what community leaders are saying, it kind of raises that pride in them and that respect. And then whatever comes out of that could come out of it. I mean, there's different ways that it could go, but I think. Just fundamentally knowing that they have, the elders there who are their teachers, but also knowing that, knowing that their culture and their existence is validated, it goes a long way to being engaged and to wanting to learn. So yeah, I guess that's what I would say.
Melissa, thank you for a really interesting talk, and good to see you again. I guess we had you as a speaker, invited speaker, listen 2 years ago at the Canadian Society of Soil Science annual meeting. I have two really quick questions. First one is something fairly similar to what Stan asked, and I guess this is something you didn't specifically talk about. It's relating to people's interest to work on land in the First Nations. Like, what will be the cause, or what would your project be doing to try to attract First Nations people to work on the land, like be a farmer and so forth? Number two, very quick question. The second quick question is, within your project, how you try to, I guess, learn from the First Nations people, like what could be techniques for land management that could be promoted for improving land sustainability and so forth.
Okay, so the first question about how to, I guess, attract people within the communities to work in whatever capacity within lands. It's actually it is a big challenge, to be honest, because it's kind of a thankless job. Because if I just thinking about First Nations lands departments and lands managers, they're not just dealing with agricultural land; they're dealing with a whole bunch of other stuff, and it's probably one of the biggest portfolios that might someone might hold within a First Nation. So it can be a really thankless job because you're carrying so much. But yeah, I mean, it is challenging, honestly, because there's been kind of a legacy of Indian Affairs coming in and doing what they're going to do, and sort of like that, I guess, that skill set that probably my grandparents' generation had and my parents' generation had got so disrupted, and so that it's a big hurdle to overcome. But you know what I think a lot of communities are doing, which I think is so valuable, is land-based learning has become such a critical element within education within nations, and that also includes language learning. And so, like I said at the beginning of my talk, what got me interested in the environment is I went to cultural camps when I was a kid. And so, yeah, I think there's huge hurdles to overcome, but I mean, we have to start somewhere. And so I guess very practical, from a practical standpoint, even say within the Living Lab, for example, well, we hire students from the nations. And, this year we're going to have a much more active year. We'll have students coming out and working alongside the technicians to collect soil samples, the basic stuff, but just to get exposed to that. And then have those students have the chance to come visit the university and actually come into the lab and seeing, wow, this is what happens at a university. So that's, I guess, one way. I know of other communities who have initiated sort of banned control over some of their farmland, who are having the local, it's sort of gender split still, but a lot of the local young men start learning how to drive the tractors, the sprayers, and just having that employment opportunity as well. That's happening. So yeah, I guess, there's a lot to overcome, but it's, moving slowly, I guess, towards an improvement from what it has been the last 20, 30 years. And then, sorry, your second question was, I forget.
Are there any practices the First Nation people doing on land management that could be promoted?
Yeah, no, I mean, any practices, not specifically in have we been hiding these secret practices that we haven't been sharing? Not so much that. I'm sorry, I'm making a joke out of it, but it's a good question. One of the things I guess that I will say is there definitely is an interest in sort of cultural burning or prescribed burning as a potential strategy, because that's what that's what we did. And then as well, not so much, I guess, any really specific practice, but I think what is of real interest is more of an integrated, more on a small scale, let's say, integrate agroforestry, that sort of thing, more of a diversification at a smaller scale for food production. That's certainly been of interest that people have talked about. So, and I think in part one of the things that within our own communities that we're trying to do is like a lot of that knowledge, a lot of that let's quote unquote traditional ecological knowledge got so disrupted. You know, if we've only got 14% of native grassland in the prairies, well, what else got lost at that same time? There's real cultural teachings, language also, and those languages held that ecological knowledge. And so that's why we have these initiatives to revitalize language, because the language holds that ecological knowledge as well. And so there's a real, I guess, push towards doing that. So thank you.
My question, my question is concerning, you said that First and Second World War veterans were given or purchased treaty lands, and they were class 1, 2, and 3 soils.
Yeah.
Were they sold, or were they forced to sell them? Was it voluntary? How was it done? And are some of those lands now being the lands that are purchased back into the reserves?
A very small amount have been purchased back of that same parcel of land. So the lands were sold. So there was money that was received to the nations from the Crown. But what has been argued successfully through the court system is that oftentimes it was either the land was undervalued, or the conditions for the sale was, well, let's just say like rather shady and either coercive. And basically the argument around those specific claims cases is that essentially the Crown breached their fiduciary duty by essentially enabling these pretty nefarious sales to go on. And so that has been proven in multiple cases across, well, not just in the prairies, but across Canada.
So what has been the outcome of those cases? Is the money or the land returned, or is it just too bad, so sad?
A bit of, well, it's more complex. So money, the monies are received, so the land isn't returned back, but sort of I'm sure there's a formula that would sort of go into how much money would be negotiated as part of the claim, and then that money can be used to purchase land. So that's what has been happening a lot, is land purchases have been made. And it might not be agricultural land, it might be urban land, it might be other, for example, my community, we bought land that contained this beautiful lake, and it's solely used for recreation and for hunting and fishing and cultural practices. It's no economic development at all.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Oh, over here.
I was struck by your figure of 60,000 acres to a person. I'm just wondering how it ever got to the point where one person is managing 60,000 acres of land. Can that be done successfully at all? And are there any initiatives to walk that back and maybe get more people working on that area?
Right. Yeah. Okay. So for just to correct that. So when I said 60,000 acres, I meant so the community, the nation has that 60,000 acres. Let's say that's their land, but the staff within the nation who's sort of meant to manage it might be only one. And in large. For some communities, they have a full department, so they might have 5 or 6 staff, and so there's a lot more capacity. They might have somebody who has got GIS expertise. They might have somebody who has, who might be the pasture manager. There might be somebody who's dealing only with the leases. So in those cases, it's not too bad, but nevertheless, even with that capacity, it's still really hard to, especially with those lands that might be really quite far away from their home reserve, so you have to drive, 100 kilometers or more in some cases. But yeah, I mean, there's actually a lot of pride in having that land. That not in terms of like, we think about, let's say, a farm. We're not talking about it as like a single farmer farming 60,000 acres. There might be multiple different land users that are using that land, and it could be pasture land, it could be cropland, but it is true that there might be maybe only one person who's actually communicating with the lessees of that land, and that can be difficult depending on what the background and the experience and the expertise is of that person. But there are cases where there are really large-scale farmers that might be farming land on multiple nations. So the individual farm, non-Indigenous farmer, might be farming, 50,000 acres, and maybe 10,000 acres are on community number 1, and 2,000 acres are on community number 2, and that happens as well. Yeah.
Hi, I'm from deep southern Alberta and up to University of Alberta to take agriculture. And as the years went by and I graduated, I had a former premier of Saskatchewan in my class, in my master's class in agricultural economics. His name is Grant Devine. I'll ask this question in terms of the progress that I'm witnessing very happily of what you've accomplished in Saskatchewan. And if there's some comment that you might make that would help us in Alberta to do at least as well as Saskatchewan has done, and hopefully even better.
Well, that's a tough question. I don't know Alberta well enough to know what sort of the policy landscape is around that, so I don't feel quite qualified to answer that question with respect to Alberta. Although I will say, I think one of the strengths of Saskatchewan in terms of the treaty land entitlement process, which Grant Devine would have been premier during that time, was that it was a collective. It was multiple nations all coming together collectively to do this. So there's the strength in the numbers, whereas I'm not sure exactly what it is in Alberta, but my understanding it's been more kind of on a piecemeal basis, but somebody might be able to correct me on that. But that's kind of my understanding. So I think one of the strengths was that in Saskatchewan, it was initially 25 nations that worked with the provincial and the federal governments to ratify the Treaty Land Entitlement Framework Agreement. So yeah, I guess that's all, maybe that's all the extent of my knowledge that I can answer that. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for joining us for this afternoon presentation. I'm Guillermo Hernandez, leading this year's Bentley Lecture Committee, and we would like to offer our thanks to Dr. Arcand for accepting our invitation to join us here in Edmonton and describing her research and her work with a Bridge to the Land, Water, Sky. Thank you, Melissa. We have a small gift of gratitude for you for sharing your knowledge with us here at the University of Alberta. I see you. Yep. We are grateful to everyone who has joined us today, including some esteemed guests, including Dr. Florence Gladfield, and a representative of our sponsor organizations, as Dr. Dim Stanblade mentioned before, Corteva, but also Alberta Grains and also the Agroecology Institute. It's great that this event is about sharing knowledge, but also about networking, as much as it's also about learning from our speaker. There is one more part to this event, which is actually happening in the adjoining room, the student poster presentations, which happened before the lecture, but they are still on, so there will still be chances to check on those posters and to talk to the students in the next while. a number of our students showcase their excellent research today in this afternoon. And we have several volunteer judges, volunteer evaluators who kindly help us to evaluate those presentations. And they look into the title, the introduction, the method that it was presented in those poster presentations, the images, very comprehensive evaluation, the context as well as the contents as well. And we are able to see also the presentation skills of those speakers and their knowledge, their ability to answer questions. This evaluator, our volunteer judge, had now completed their deliberations, and they had now selected finalists. So let's offer some good news to those 3 students who have been selected as award winners of these presentations. And after we finish this part of the program, you can try to find me, and there will be some cash awards. So you are being awarded for your efforts as well. You're being recognized. We would like to present these prizes to our 3 top winners, and they are Sondas Butte, Sharundra De Silva, and Shenke Han. So all 3 of them, let's get a hand up to them. And yes, please find me so that we can actually distribute some of that award to you and the recognition for your work. But we are grateful to all of them. We are actually, we thank all the students who actually participated today, as well as the evaluators that help us to talk with the students and look into their research. We actually want to be also expressing our gratitude to the team in relations, including Kathleen, but also all her team, and also Alessia, that also helped in many other different capacities, Christine in the office, and also, actually, we also want to mention Dr. Stan Blade, standing here in the back. He had been a strong supporter of the Bentley Lecture now over 10 years. So we are grateful for the leadership that you have provided to our faculty and the way that we have been able to develop and grow Bentley Lecture. Thank you very much, and all the best in your next steps in your career. I would like to thank the audience that came today, and please feel free to enjoy the rest of the afternoon. We will have now the reception, so there is food. Now, the food is in the hall, and these spaces will also be available, so you can come and go, and the posters are still on, so you can go and check the poster, talk to the students. These spaces will be available for interacting and mixing, networking with others. The bar will reopen. So it's reopening, and it will close at about 5:30, but the whole reception will stay active until about 6:30. So just make plans for yourself to get safe to home, so that you are able also to share also these experiences with others, as well as we are going to be posting this recording in the ELS YouTube channel. In the YouTube channel, you have that video available. Please feel free to share that video within your network, with people who would like to share this event and to be able to learn more about Indigenous knowledge, but also to be able to share the message that Melissa had been able to share with us, to deliver for us today. And please plan to join us again in next year for Canada's Agricultural Day for the next annual Bentley Lecture. Thank you very much.